Before the Senate, before the legions, before Caesar, before the empire that would rule a quarter of the known world, there was a murder. Not the murder of an enemy, not the execution of a traitor, a brother killing a brother. The year, by Roman tradition, was 753 BC. The place, a hilltop above the Tiber River, in the centre of a world that had no idea what was about to be unleashed upon it. And the man holding the weapon was not a barbarian, not a tyrant, not some conqueror from a distant land. He was the founder. His name was Romulus. The story, as the Romans told it, is almost too brutal to believe. Romulus and his twin brother Remus had survived everything, abandoned as infants, suckled by a she-wolf in the wild, raised as outcasts. By their own legend, they were sons of Mars, the god of war himself. They had destroyed the king who tried to murder them, they had led an army, they had built something out of nothing. And then they destroyed each other over a wall. Who would build the city, and on which hill? When the gods, through the flight of birds, gave the decision to Romulus, Remus refused to accept it. So he leapt over the freshly raised stones of his brother's new city wall. A deliberate mockery, a symbolic violation of the sacred boundary. Romulus killed him. The ancient sources record the moment without sentiment. Remus mocked. Remus died. Romulus ruled alone. Here is the brutal truth that Rome could never outrun. Its very first act as a city was fratricide. It was born in blood, consecrated with the death of a brother, and it would spend the next 12 centuries proving that this was not a tragedy. It was a blueprint. This is how it all began. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome to Wars in History. We do not sugarcoat the past. We tell the real stories of warfare, power and survival that shaped human civilization, raw, gritty and without the comfortable myths hit. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And drop a comment right now. Which of Rome's 7 kings do you think was the most dangerous? I read every single answer. Now, back to Rome. To understand why Rome became Rome, you have to understand the land it was born into. Central Western Italy, in the centuries before 800 BC, was a fragmented and violent world. Dozens of tribes competed for the same river valleys, the same grazing land, the same river crossings. No single power dominated. Everyone was vulnerable. And the geography, rugged hills, sudden rivers, dense marshland, guaranteed that the only way to survive was to be harder than every single one of your neighbours. The region called Latium was a small triangle of fertile volcanic soil sitting on the left bank of the Tiber River. To the south, the Pontine marshes swallowed armies whole. To the east, the Apennine Mountains formed a jagged wall. These natural barriers made Latium defensible, but they also made it a trap. Boxed in on 3 sides, the Latin tribes could not expand easily. They were constantly under pressure from the peoples around them, the Sabines to the northeast, the Volsci to the south, the Equi to the east, and to the northwest, directly across the Tiber, sat a civilization that made every Latin village look like a cattle pen. The Etruscans. In 800 BC, Etruria was not a single nation, but a thriving confederation of powerful city-states, Veii, Caere, Tarquinia, Volsci, stretching across what is today Tuscany and northern Lazio. The Etruscans were traders, engineers, artists, and warriors of a calibre the Latin tribes simply could not match. They had mastered metalworking, hydraulic engineering, urban planning, and religious ceremony. They traded with the Greeks, the Carthaginians, and the peoples of the Near East. Their cities were wealthy, cosmopolitan, and strategically positioned, and they were not content to simply observe their southern neighbours. Beginning as early as the 7th century BC, Etruscan culture began penetrating the cluster of hills where Rome would rise. Archaeology confirms that the first monumental structures at that site, the first stone foundations, the first large-scale drainage infrastructure, were Etruscan in their techniques. The ancient Greek historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus wrote that many ancient writers considered Rome itself to be an Etruscan city. That overstates things, but it reflects a historical reality that Rome's own traditions preserved. 2 of Rome's 7 kings bore the Etruscan royal family name Tarquinius. The last 3 kings of Rome had direct Etruscan connections. The fasces, the bundle of rods around an axe that became the supreme symbol of Roman executive power, came from Etruria. The toga, the triumph ceremony, the practice of divining the future from animal entrails, all adapted from Etruscan ritual. Rome was born in isolation. It was built in part on a foundation that Etruria helped lay, but the city still needed a founder, and legend, if not strict history, provided one. April 21st, 753 BC. The Parilia, the ancient festival of the shepherd deity Pales. This is the date that Roman historians, working centuries after the fact, assigned to the founding of Rome. The reality was almost certainly messier, a slow generational process of settlement, growth, and conflict stretching across decades. But the Romans needed a birth date, a moment of creation, a myth with sharp edges, and the myth they chose told you everything about who they were. According to the tradition preserved by Livy and Plutarch, Romulus consecrated the founding with a solemn religious rite. He yoked a white bull and a white cow to a bronze plough and drew a sacred furrow around the Palatine Hill, defining the Pomerium, the inviolable boundary of the city. This was not merely a building project, it was a covenant with the gods. The Pomerium was sacred ground. To cross it uninvited or to mock it was a crime against heaven itself. Remus demonstrated exactly how serious Romulus was. With his brother dead and the boundary drawn, Romulus faced a problem that would define the entire character of early Rome. His new settlement was packed with men, soldiers, exiles, runaway slaves, fugitives, and outcasts from across Latium. Precisely the kind of desperate, dangerous men who could hold a wall against any enemy, but virtually no women. No women meant no children. No children meant the city died within 1 generation. Romulus's solution was staggering in its audacity. He announced a great festival, the Consualia, held in honour of the deity Consus, and sent open invitations to the neighbouring peoples of the region, the Seninenses, the Crustumini, the Antemnates. Most critically, he invited the Sabines, a substantial Italic people from the hills to the northeast, and the Sabines came in numbers, bringing their entire families with them. When the crowds were at their most relaxed, packed around the spectacle of the games, Romulus gave a prearranged signal. Every unmarried Sabine woman was seized. The men were driven off, the women were taken. According to Livy, Romulus personally moved among the captive women, speaking to each one. He told them that their captivity was the fault of their own fathers, who had refused the right of intermarriage to their neighbours. He promised them honourable marriage, full civic rights, property rights, and the dignity of bearing free Roman children. Cicero, writing centuries later, confirmed the calculation behind the act, calling the abduction a deliberate policy to strengthen the new state and safeguard the resources of the Roman people. The Sabine fathers returned with spears. What followed was a war, but it ended in one of the ancient world's most extraordinary truces. The Sabine women, by then wives and mothers physically, threw themselves between the 2 armies on the field of battle and refused to move. They would not allow their fathers to kill their husbands, or their husbands to kill their fathers. Both sides stood down. A peace was struck. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, became co-ruler of Rome alongside Romulus. The 2 peoples merged into one. Rome had solved its first existential crisis the same way it would solve almost every crisis for the next 1,000 years. Through organised, calculated violence, followed by complete ruthless assimilation. The wolf had its pack. Now it needed kings. Rome did not spring into existence as an empire. It began as a village with ambitions, ruled by 7 kings across 2.5 centuries, and the story of those kings is the story of a city learning, through blood, treachery, war and reform, exactly what it had to become to survive. The Romans themselves, writing centuries after the fact, admitted that the details were murky. Fires, wars, and the erasure of records made certainty impossible. But the broad strokes, confirmed by archaeology and by ancient traditions preserved in Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and Plutarch, tell a story that is unmistakably real. A city rising from nothing, absorbing everything it could not kill, killing everything it could not absorb. 7 men, 2.5 centuries, one city that refused to die. The first king, Romulus, 753 to 716 BC. Romulus did not merely found a city. He designed a system of power from the ground up, and he designed it to outlast him. He organized the Roman citizenry into 3 tribal divisions: the Ramns, native Romans, the Tetes, the merged Sabines, and the Luceres, a third group, likely of Etruscan origin. These divisions were not administrative convenience. They were the skeleton of a war machine. Each tribe contributed horsemen, fighters, and resources to the common defense. Rome, even in its first generation, was organized around the logic of mobilization. Alongside the tribal structure, Romulus divided the populace into 30 curiae, ward units named, according to the tradition, after the 30 Sabine women who had thrown themselves between the armies to stop the war. These curiae formed the voting units of the Comitia Curiata, Rome's earliest popular assembly. And to stand above that assembly, to advise the king and lend legitimacy to his decrees, Romulus created an institution that would outlast every king, every tyrant, and eventually Rome itself, the Senate. He appointed 100 men, the patres, the fathers, drawn from the most senior heads of the most powerful families. Their role was advisory. Their power was real. The patrician class, the aristocracy of blood, was born in that room, and it would fight to hold its privileges for centuries to come. Romulus ruled for 37 years. His death, or rather his disappearance, was recorded in one of the strangest passages in Roman history. During a review of troops on the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, a violent storm swept in. When it cleared, Romulus was gone. The official story, accepted by Roman tradition, was that Mars had taken his son bodily up into the heavens. A more cynical reading, preserved by the historian Livy himself, noted that the senators who surrounded Romulus that day had every reason to want him gone, and that the storm provided a very convenient cover. Romulus was worshipped after his death as the god Quirinus. Whether he ascended to divinity, or was simply murdered in the dark and his body hidden, the Senate moved immediately to consolidate its power in the absence of a king. Rome's first constitutional crisis, who rules between kings, was resolved by the system of interregnum, in which the Senate governed in rotating 10-day shifts until a new king was chosen. The second king, Numa Pompilius, 715 to 673 BC. After the blood and iron of Romulus, Rome chose a man who was almost his opposite. Numa Pompilius was a Sabine, selected not by hereditary succession, but by the Senate and the people, who went to the Sabine town of Cures to ask him to take the throne. He was known for his wisdom, his piety, and his almost aggressive desire for peace. Livy records that Numa found Rome intoxicated by war, its citizens as much brigands as soldiers, and set himself the task of civilizing them through religion and law. He established the calendar of Roman sacred observances, organized the priestly colleges that would govern Roman religious life for centuries, and is credited with founding the cult of the Vestal Virgins, the 6 sacred women who tended the eternal flame of the goddess Vesta in the Roman Forum. Numa's legacy was not military, it was institutional. He created the framework of Roman state religion, the official priests who governed declarations of war and treaties, the Pontifex Maximus who oversaw all religious affairs, the Flamens who served individual deities. By weaving religious ritual into every act of public life, Numa made Roman government inseparable from Roman religion. A Roman general could not march to war without consulting the gods. A consul could not take office without the correct omens. This was not superstition, it was political technology. It gave the ruling class a divine legitimacy that made every act of the state feel like an act of heaven. Numa ruled for over 40 years. When he died, the Romans, exhausted by peace, chose a warmonger. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, 672 to 641 BC. Tullus Hostilius was everything Numa was not. He reportedly despised religious observance, held the priesthoods in contempt, and believed that a city kept healthy only through constant war. He was, in the judgment of the ancient sources, the most bellicose king Rome ever had, and he had serious competition. His reign was defined by 3 conflicts, each one teaching Rome something it could not have learned in peacetime. First was the war with Alba Longa, the mother city of Rome itself, the settlement from which Romulus and Remus had descended. The 2 cities had coexisted uneasily, and under Tullus the tension finally erupted into open war. In a moment of tactical genius, Tullus proposed to settle the conflict through single combat between champions, Rome's Horatii brothers against Alba's Curiati brothers. The Horatii won. But this did not end the war, it merely delayed the inevitable. When the Alban dictator Metius Fufetius treacherously changed sides during a subsequent battle against Veii and the Fidenats, Tullus's response was absolute. Metius was tied between 2 chariots and torn apart. Alba Longa was razed to the ground. Its entire population, tens of thousands of people, was forcibly relocated to Rome, swelling the city's population and expanding its base of fighting men. The mother city was simply erased from the map. What survived that erasure was an institution. Tullus built the Curia Hostilia, the Senate House, on the northern edge of the Roman Forum, the physical home of the Senate that would stand for over 500 years. The building's very name, named for a warmonger king, said something about the relationship between Roman political life and Roman military life. They were always the same thing. Tullus died violently, struck by lightning, an act which the Romans interpreted as divine punishment for his neglect of religious duties. Even in death, Numa's lesson reasserted itself. In Rome, you ignored the gods at your peril. The 4th king, Ancus Marcius, 641 to 616 BC. The grandson of Numa Pompilius, Ancus Marcius inherited his grandfather's religious temperament, but paired it with a warrior's practicality that his predecessors had lacked. He understood that peace required protection, and that protection required infrastructure. His reign was a masterclass in the kind of strategic building that transformed a warlord settlement into a functioning city-state. Ancus built Rome's first bridge over the Tiber, the Pont Sublicius, a wooden structure that both connected Rome to the Etruscan lands on the opposite bank, and became, in a crisis decades later, one of the most famous defensive positions in Roman history. He fortified the Janiculum Hill on the western bank of the Tiber, built Rome's first prison on the Capitoline Hill, and founded the port city of Ostia at the mouth of the river, giving Rome its first direct access to Mediterranean trade. His military campaigns were calculated expansions, not rage-fueled raids. He fought the Latin tribes to the south and west, defeated them, and then, rather than destroying them as Tullus had destroyed Alba, he offered them Roman citizenship and relocated them to the Aventine Hill. This act was foundational. It set a precedent that Rome would return to again and again across the centuries, absorb the defeated, make them Roman, turn conquered enemies into taxpayers and soldiers. The Roman population swelled, the borders of Roman territory expanded. Ancus died of natural causes after a reign of 25 years, a remarkably peaceful exit for a Roman king, and left behind a city that was now an economic and military force of genuine regional consequence. Rome was no longer just a hilltop settlement, it was a state. The 5th king, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, 616 to 579 BC. With Tarquinius Priscus, the whole character of Rome changed. He was an outsider, born in the Etruscan city of Tarquinia to a Greek father named Maritus and an Etruscan mother. His wife, Tanaquil, was an Etruscan noblewoman of exceptional intelligence and ambition, who, according to ancient tradition, read the omens on the road to Rome and told her husband that this city was where their destiny lay. Whether that story is legend or history is almost irrelevant. The result was the same. Tarquinius Priscus arrived at Rome, used his wealth, his charisma, and his extraordinary capabilities to ingratiate himself with the Roman aristocracy, and upon the death of Ancus Marcius, He was elected king, the first foreigner ever to sit on Rome's throne. His reign transformed Rome physically. He is credited with commissioning the Circus Maximus for chariot racing, draining the marshy low ground between the hills through the engineering marvel of the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer, one of the oldest surviving structures of ancient Rome, and beginning the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, the most sacred building in Roman religious life. He expanded the Senate from 200 members to 300, adding 100 new patrician families, and he expanded the Roman cavalry significantly. He fought and won wars against the Sabines, the Latins, and the Etruscans, securing Rome's dominance in the region. Tarquinius Priscus was everything Etruscan civilization could offer: sophistication, engineering genius, strategic vision, and he poured it all into Rome. He was assassinated by the sons of Ancus Marcius, who had never forgiven the outsider for taking a throne they believed was theirs. His widow Tanaquil, with extraordinary presence of mind, managed to conceal his death long enough to secure the throne for the next king. The sixth king, Servius Tullius, 578 to 534 BC. Servius Tullius may be the most consequential king Rome ever had. His origins were murky even to the Romans themselves. Some said he was the son of a Latin prisoner of war who had become a servant in Tarquinius's household. Others claimed Etruscan descent, and a tradition preserved in Etruscan wall paintings identified him as the Etruscan warlord Mastana, a companion of the hero Caelus Verbenna. Whatever his origins, the substance of his reign was undeniable. Servius Tullius revolutionized the entire basis of Roman society. The centerpiece of his reforms, what historians call the Servian constitution, was the census. For the first time in Roman history, every male citizen was counted, categorized, and assigned to a class based on the value of his property. 5 classes were established, with the wealthiest at the top and the landless at the bottom. Each class was then subdivided into military units called centuries, and those centuries served double duty. They were both the basic unit of Rome's army and the basic unit of Rome's voting assembly, the Comitia Centuriata. The result was an elegant, brutal calculation. The wealthier you were, the better armed you were required to be, the closer to the front of the battle line you were placed, and the more your vote counted in the assembly. Military obligation and political power were fused into a single, inseparable system. Rome's government was now its army, and its army was its government. The military implications alone were staggering. Rome now had a citizen army of a size and organisation that no neighbouring tribe could match. The first class, the wealthiest citizens, were expected to arrive fully equipped as heavy infantry: bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves, round shield, spear, and sword. The lower classes provided lighter troops, slingers, and support. Together, they formed a phalanx, a wall of spears and shields that moved as one organism. Servius expanded the city's boundaries, incorporated all 7 hills within Rome's sacred limits, and began the construction of the massive defensive wall that still bears his name, though archaeologists date its present form to the 4th century BC, following a later rebuilding after the Gallic sack. He also gave the plebeians, the common people, a political voice through the assembly structure, which infuriated the old patrician families. Servius Tullius was, in many ways, Rome's first populist, and like many populists before and after him, it got him killed. His own daughter Tullia and her husband, who would become the final king of Rome, arranged his assassination. According to the tradition preserved by Livy, Tullia drove her chariot over her father's body in the street as he lay dying. The road where this happened was known afterward as the Vicus Sceleratus, the street of crime. The 7th king, Tarquinius Superbus, the Proud, 534 to 509 BC, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, was the grandson of Tarquinius Priscus and the son-in-law of Servius Tullius, the man he had just had murdered. He took the throne not through election, not through the endorsement of the Senate, and not through any of the constitutional forms that even the kings before him had nominally respected. He simply sat down in it, surrounded himself with armed men, and dared anyone to object. None of the previous kings had held absolute power. Tarquin did. He executed senators who opposed him without trial. He consulted the Senate only when it suited him. He taxed the people heavily to fund his building, projects, and his wars. He made the office of king synonymous with the word that Rome would come to fear above all others, tyrant. And yet, even Tarquin built things that mattered. He completed the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill that his grandfather had begun. He extended Roman power through successful wars against the Volsci and the Gabii. He negotiated treaties with the Latin cities that cemented Roman dominance in Latium. He was cruel, politically illegitimate, and constitutionally abhorrent. But he was also effective. The problem with effective tyrants is that they make everyone around them afraid to breathe. The Senate sat in silence. The people bent under the tax burden. The aristocracy watched their colleagues disappear and said nothing. Tarquin the Proud ruled through fear for 25 years, and for 25 years fear worked. Until the night a Roman nobleman named Sextus Tarquinius, the king's own son, walked into the bedchamber of a woman named Lucretia, and everything ended. A note on the Senate. Before we move to the revolution that ended the monarchy, it is worth pausing on the institution that made the Republic possible. The Senate was not created in a single act. Romulus established the original 100 patres. Tarquinius Priscus raised the number to 300. Servius Tullius, in his reforming zeal, expanded its base further. By the end of the regal period, the Senate was a body of 300 of Rome's most powerful men, wealthy, militarily experienced, politically ambitious, and deeply resentful of any king who forgot that they existed. The Senate did not vote on laws in the early Republic. It did not command armies directly, but it held the power of auctoritas, formal authority, the weight of collective aristocratic opinion that no Roman magistrate could simply ignore. It controlled state finances, foreign policy, and the assignment of military commands. More importantly, in the final years of the monarchy, it was the Senate that held the institutional memory of what Rome had been before Tarquin, a city where power was shared, where law had meaning, where the king governed with consent. That memory was the Senate's most dangerous weapon, and when the moment came, they used it. The 7 kings were gone. The Senate remained. The Republic was about to begin. Every system of power, no matter how well designed, contains within it the seed of its own destruction. The Romans who came after the monarchy understood this better than almost any people in the ancient world. They had lived under a king who proved it. His name was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, and the story of how he ended and what replaced him is not simply a political story or a legal story. It is a story about what happens when a city reaches its absolute limit, when the accumulated weight of fear, grief, and humiliation finally compresses into something as hard and as sharp as a blade. The revolution of 509 BC did not begin in the Senate. It did not begin with a general or an army. It began with a woman who refused to survive what had been done to her, and it ended with a man ordering the execution of his own sons to prove that the republic he had created was not a negotiable arrangement. This is the story of the most consequential revolution in Western history. Tarquin the Proud had seized power through murder and ruled through terror, and he never pretended otherwise. Where the kings before him had at least maintained the forms of the old constitutional order, seeking Senate ratification, consulting the popular, assembly governing through law, Tarquin abolished the pretense. He executed senators without trial and without explanation. He made no new senatorial appointments to replace them, deliberately depleting the Senate of its numbers and its authority. He surrounded himself at all times with a bodyguard of armed men, drew a hard ring of steel between himself and the citizenry, and made it understood that any man who questioned him would simply disappear. His contempt for the law was matched by his contempt for tradition. He tore up the treaties Servius Tullius had made with the Latin cities and renegotiated them from a position of naked dominance. He humiliated the Latin leaders in ways calculated to wound their dignity, summoning them to meetings on his terms, in his time, and making them wait. He extracted labour from the Roman people for his building projects, most notably the completion of the great Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, treating free citizens as if they were slaves. This was not merely cruel, it was a deliberate inversion of the Roman moral order. Free men built the city, slaves were property. Tarquin had blurred the line between the two, and every man in Rome who swung a pickaxe on his temple understood exactly what that meant. His military campaigns at least produced results. He waged war against the Volsci and captured the city of Suessa Pomitia, looting it of enough silver to fund the Capitoline Temple's construction. He attacked the city of Gabii, an old Latin rival, and when direct assault failed, he used his son Sextus as a mole. Sextus presented himself to the Gabini as a refugee from his father's cruelty, whipped and humiliated, begging for shelter. The Gabini, who had no reason to disbelieve him, took him in and eventually gave him military command. Sextus then systematically destroyed Gabii's leadership from within, executing, exiling, or discrediting every man of influence, before delivering the city to his father without a siege. Tarquin confirmed the strategy by sending his son a wordless message. He walked into his garden and knocked the heads off the tallest poppies. Kill the leaders, the rest will follow. This was not merely a military tactic, it was a philosophy of power. By the late 500s, 10s BC, Tarquin had achieved something no previous Roman king had managed. He had made Rome feared rather than respected throughout central Italy. The Latin cities had signed a treaty that recognized Roman hegemony. The Etruscan cities to the north watched nervously. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, nearing completion, was an architectural declaration that Rome was the dominant city of the Italian world. From the outside, the reign looked like a success. From the inside, it was a city holding its breath. It could not hold it forever. The event that ended the monarchy began as a wager between bored soldiers on campaign. In the year 509 BC, Tarquin's army was besieging the city of Ardea, the capital of the Rutuli to the south of Rome. The siege was bogging down, the city was well fortified, and the campaign had become a long, frustrating wait. The king's sons and their companions had begun passing the time in their tents with wine and conversation, and at some point the talk turned, as it often does among men with too much time and too little action, to the question of their wives. Each man argued that his own wife was the most virtuous woman in Rome. Sextus Tarquinius was among them. So was a man named Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, a cousin of the royal family, whose wife, Lucretia, was famous throughout Rome for her beauty, her intelligence, and the austerity of her domestic virtue. The men settled the argument the only way soldiers settle anything. They decided to see for themselves. Riding through the night, they visited the homes of each contestant's wife without warning. The wives of the princes were found feasting and entertaining, laughing with friends in the absence of their husbands. At the house in the town of Calatia they found Lucretia. She was seated in the atrium by lamplight with her household women, spinning wool well past midnight, working while everyone else in the city slept. The contest was decided on the spot. Lucretia was, by common agreement, everything a Roman wife should be. She welcomed the unexpected visitors warmly, without complaint, and had supper laid out for them. Sextus Tarquinius noted everything. The beauty, the composure, the absolute unassailable virtue of the woman in that lamplit room. And something in him decided in that moment that he would destroy it. Livy records without flinching the nature of what followed. And so will we, because what followed was not merely the crime that ended a monarchy. It was the event that defined, for 5 centuries of Roman history, the line between acceptable power and intolerable tyranny. Days after the contest, Sextus Tarquinius returned to Calatia alone, without warning and without his cousin's knowledge. He presented himself as a traveller, a kinsman deserving hospitality, and Lucretia, acting as the Roman code of hospitality demanded, received him, fed him, and had a guest room prepared. The household went to sleep. The city went to sleep. The night deepened. When every lamp in the house was dark and every sound had faded, Sextus Tarquinius rose from his bed with a drawn sword. He entered Lucretia's chamber. He pressed the blade against her chest. He told her who he was and what would happen to her if she cried out. When threats of death alone failed to move her, he added the threat that has haunted this story for 2,500 years. He told her that if she refused him, he would kill her, kill a slave, place their naked bodies together in her bed, and report to the world that he had caught her in adultery and killed them both to defend his cousin's honour, death she could face, dishonour, the destruction of her name, her children's name, everything she stood for. She could not. She submitted. Sextus Tarquinius rode away before dawn. Lucretia did not move until first light. Then she sent messengers to her father in Rome and to her husband at the army camp, asking each man to come to her immediately and to bring a trusted friend. Her father, Spurius Lucretius, came with Publius Valerius. Her husband, Collatinus, came with Lucius Junius Brutus. They found her sitting dressed in mourning black, her face composed into something beyond grief, something that Livy describes as the absolute stillness of a woman who's already made her decision and is merely waiting to execute it. She told them everything, every detail without evasion. She demanded vengeance. She told them that while her body had been violated, her mind was not guilty, that she was innocent, but that she could not live inside the body that had been defiled. The men tried to dissuade her. They told her that the guilt lay entirely with Sextus, not with her. She agreed. She told them that she accepted their absolution, and then she drew a knife from beneath her robe and drove it into her own heart. The men stood over her body in silence. In that silence, everything the monarchy had been was over, whether any of them knew it yet or not. The man who picked up the knife from Lucretia's body was Lucius Junius Brutus, and the first thing that knife did in his hands was unmask him. For years, decades in fact, Brutus had been hiding. He was the nephew of Tarquin the Proud. His father and his brother had already been murdered by the king, who saw in Brutus's family an aristocratic bloodline that posed a potential threat. Brutus had survived by doing something that required extraordinary nerve and extraordinary patience. He had pretended to be an idiot. The word the Romans used was Brutus, dull, stupid, simple. He had deliberately performed incompetence and mental vacancy so convincingly that Tarquin dismissed him as harmless, allowed him to live, and even allowed him to hold the ceremonial position of tribune of the sealers, the royal bodyguard, which gave him a legal right to address the Roman people in the absence of the king. Lucius Junius Brutus had spent years being underestimated. Now, standing over the body of Lucretia with her blood on his hands, he was done. He carried the body to the Roman Forum. The markets were open, the streets were crowded, and Brutus laid the corpse of Lucretia in public view and began to speak. Livy preserves the essence of the speech. Brutus denounced Sextus Tarquinius not merely as a rapist, but as the inevitable product of his father's tyranny. He catalogued the crimes of the monarchy, the executions, the forced labour, the silent senate, the trampled laws, the destroyed families. He held up the body of a woman who had chosen death over dishonour and told the crowd that this woman, this death, this crime, was what the monarchy had produced. And then he asked them whether they were willing to keep living under men who produced such things. Rome's answer was immediate. The people of Rome, assembled in the Forum, voted to exile the Tarquin family and to abolish the monarchy. The army at Ardea, when Brutus rode out to address them, made the same decision. The city gates were closed against Tarquin when he returned from the siege. He was met not with submission but with locked doors in a city that had become, overnight, something it had never been before. A republic. The Roman Republic was not an accident. It was a deliberate, carefully engineered response to everything the monarchy had done wrong. Every feature of the new system was designed with one specific fear in mind. Never again must one man hold unlimited power over Rome. The kingship was replaced not with a single executive, but with two, the consuls. Two men, elected annually by the Comitia Centuriata, the same military assembly created by Servian reform, each holding equal authority, each able to veto any act of the other. The Latin word for this veto was the single most important word in the republican system, intercessio. One man reaches out to stop another, the entire mechanism of constitutional constraint distilled into a single gesture. No consul could act without being answerable to his colleague. No consul could hold office for more than 1 year. No man could serve 2 consecutive terms. The memory of Tarquin's endless, unaccountable reign was baked into every clause. The first 2 consuls were Lucius Junius Brutus himself and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, Lucretia's widowed husband. The pairing was deliberate. Brutus represented the revolution. Collatinus represented the family honour that had been destroyed, now redeemed through political transformation. Together, they inherited the royal imperium, the executive power, but stripped of its permanence, its absolutism, and its hereditary transmission. The fasces, the bundle of rods and axes that symbolised the right to command, to punish and to execute, were carried before them by 12 lictors, alternating month by month between the 2 men, a visual reminder that even supreme authority rotated. The Senate, revitalised by Brutus, who filled its depleted ranks back to 300 members, became the supreme deliberative body of the new state. Laws would be debated there. Foreign policy would be determined there. Military commanders would be appointed there. The Senate did not hold formal legislative power. That technically rested with the assemblies, but its collective authority, its accumulated experience, and its control over the treasury made it the engine of Roman governance for the next 4 centuries. The Republic was born as a partnership between the 2 consuls and the Senate. That partnership would be tested immediately. Tarquin the Proud was not a man who accepted defeat. From his first day in exile, he began working to reverse the revolution, and he had tools available that few exiled monarchs in the ancient world could match: money, Etruscan allies, and, most dangerously, a network of Roman aristocrats who had benefited from his reign and were quietly unhappy with the new order. In 509 BC, the same year as the Revolution, a group of Roman senators organised what history remembers as the Tarquinian conspiracy. Tarquin sent ambassadors to Rome, officially to negotiate the return of the royal family's personal property, which had been seized during the expulsion. While the Senate openly debated the request, the ambassadors met in secret with their co-conspirators to plan the king's restoration. The group included men from Rome's most prominent families, the Vitelli, the Aquili, and devastatingly, too, of the sons of Brutus himself. Titus Junius Brutus and Tiberius Junius Brutus had joined a plot to destroy everything their father had built. The conspiracy was discovered by a slave who had been present at one of their meetings and went directly to the consuls. The conspirators were arrested, their letters to Tarquin seized, and their guilt placed beyond all question. What followed was not a judicial inquiry or a hearing. It was an execution. The conspirators were bound, flogged, and beheaded in the Forum. Brutus watched his own sons die. Ancient sources record that he did not look away. He sat in his curule chair, the seat of consular authority, and watched the lictor's axe fall twice. Livy does not claim he felt nothing. He records that the father's face betrayed emotion during the punishment, even as the consul's authority remained unwavering. This was the iron at the centre of the Roman Republic. The system was not a preference. It was not a political position that could be negotiated or revised when it became personally inconvenient. It was an absolute. Even Brutus, the man who had created the Republic, was not more important than the Republic itself. The sons died. The conspiracy died with them. The Tarquinian ambassadors were expelled from Rome. Brutus did not live much longer. In the same year, Tarquin forged a military alliance with the Etruscan city of Veii, and the Veients marched on Rome. At the Battle of Silvia Arsia, the Roman army met them on the road. Tradition holds that Brutus and Arruns, one of Tarquin's sons, met each other directly in the cavalry charge and killed each other simultaneously, the founder of the Republic and the last prince of the monarchy destroying each other in the same moment. Brutus was carried back to Rome. The Roman matrons mourned him in public for a full year, the highest honour they could give to a man who, in the end, had given them everything he had. Tarquin the Proud was not finished. He had one more attempt left in him, and it would bring the greatest military threat the young republic had yet faced, a threat that would require one man to stand alone on a wooden bridge above the Tiber and hold back an army. But that is the next chapter. Before the Republic moved forward, it paused. In the days following the expulsion of the Tarquins, the Roman people gathered and took an oath. The exact wording, as Livy preserves it, was simple and permanent. Rome would never again permit any man to be king. Not a king of Rome, not a king in Rome, not even a man whose ambitions resembled those of a king. The word rex, king, became the most toxic word in the Roman political vocabulary. To call a Roman leader a king, or to suggest he wanted to be one, was not an insult. It was a death sentence. This oath was not merely symbolic, it was constitutional. It shaped every political instinct, every structural decision, every paranoid senatorial reflex for the next 5 centuries. When Julius Caesar, a man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon and made himself dictator perpetuo, received a crown offered to him at the Lupercalia festival of 44 BC and waved it away, he was waving it away in the shadow of this oath. And when the conspirators who killed him justified their daggers, the word they used was not tyrant, it was rex. The Republic was not just a system of government. It was a promise made over a woman's body by men who had watched a king prove what power, without constraint, inevitably produces. Rome would keep that promise, imperfectly, violently, and at enormous cost, for nearly 500 years. A revolution by itself changes nothing. It is only what comes immediately after the revolution, the blood spent defending it, that determines whether the new order lives or dies. The Roman Republic, born in the fury of 509 BC, did not get a single year of peace before it faced annihilation. Tarquin the Proud had not gone quietly into his exile. He had gone to every court, every warlord, every powerful Etruscan city-state in the region, and he had made the same argument at each one. Rome had violated the natural order. Kings ruled. That was the way of things. Help me retake my throne, and I will make sure you share the rewards. At first, the response was mixed. The Etruscan city of Veii sent troops and fought Rome in the first year of the Republic. At the Battle of Silvia Arsia, the Veientes were driven back, but it was a close, brutal fight, and it cost Rome its founding consul, Brutus, who died in a cavalry charge as we saw in Section 2. Rome survived that first test by the thinnest of margins, but the greater threat had not yet revealed itself. It arrived in 508 BC in the person of Lars Porsena, king of the Etruscan city of Clusium, the most powerful Etruscan warlord of his generation, and it arrived with an army that dwarfed anything Rome had faced before. Lars Porsena's army crossed the Tiber Valley and struck with a speed that panicked the Romans entirely. Before a proper defence could be organised, the Etruscans had seized the Janiculum Hill, the strategic high ground on the western bank of the Tiber, and driven the Roman farmers and settlers from the surrounding countryside into the city in a terrified flood. The gates of Rome were thrown open to receive the refugees, and with them came something almost as dangerous as the Etruscans: chaos. The city that had barely assembled itself into a republic was now a packed, frightened mob. With the Janiculum in enemy hands, the Pont Sublicius, the ancient wooden bridge of Ancus Martius, was the only crossing point on the Tiber, and if Porsena's cavalry reached it before it could be destroyed, the Etruscans would pour directly into the heart of Rome. Livy records what happened next with unmistakable reverence. A Roman officer named Publius Horatius Cocles, an experienced soldier whose name, Cocles, meant one-eyed, suggesting he had already given something of himself in previous service, looked at the bridge, looked at the oncoming Etruscan cavalry, and made a calculation. The bridge could be cut down, but it required time, and the only way to buy that time was for someone to stand at the far end of the bridge and hold the Etruscans back long enough for Roman axes to do their work. Horatius called for volunteers. 2 men stepped forward, Spurius Lartius and Titus Herminius, both men of noble birth and proven military record. The 3 of them walked to the far end of the bridge, turned their backs on Rome, and faced the Etruscan host. The ancient sources record that the Etruscans hesitated. 3 men against an army. The sheer audacity of it, the almost incomprehensible nerve, gave the attackers pause. That pause cost them the battle. Horatius and his two companions held the narrow approach with shields and spears, cutting down every man who tried to force the crossing in the confined space where numbers gave the Etruscans no advantage. The Etruscans rained arrows and javelins on the three men. They took wounds. They did not move. When the sound of the bridge timbers beginning to crack and splinter reached them from behind, Horatius ordered Lartius and Herminius to retreat across the narrowing gap while they still could. They made it. The last section of the bridge was nearly severed when Horatius, standing alone on the Etruscan bank, heard the final crash behind him. With the bridge gone, he did the only thing left. He turned to the Tiber, called aloud on the river god Tiberinus to receive him, and jumped fully armed into the current. He swam to the Roman bank under a storm of Etruscan missiles. He was wounded, the ancient sources note, with a vividness that suggests real memory, that he was hit by a spear in the buttock, but he reached the far shore alive. Rome awarded him a bronze statue in the Comitium, the central public meeting space, and a land grant of as much territory as he could personally plough in a single day. Lars Porsena's path into Rome was gone. The siege that followed would test the Republic in ways that went beyond the battlefield. The siege of Rome was brutal. Lars Porsena cut off Rome's grain supply from the countryside, and hunger began working inside the walls more effectively than any Etruscan spear. The Roman Senate, watching the city's provisions dwindle, faced the possibility that the Republic might be starved into submission. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that a young Roman nobleman named Gaius Mucius volunteered for a mission that had no reasonable expectation of survival. He would cross the river, infiltrate the Etruscan camp, and kill Lars Porsena. He crossed the Tiber alone, concealing his dagger, and made his way into the crowded Etruscan encampment on the day that Porsena was distributing pay to his soldiers. Standing in the crowd, Mucius could see a well-dressed man seated at a table conducting business alongside Porsena. Unable to tell which man was the king, afraid to ask lest his identity be revealed, Mucius chose the better dressed of the two and drove his knife into him. He had killed the king's secretary. He was seized immediately. Guards dragged him before Porsena himself. The king demanded to know who he was, who had sent him, and how many more like him were waiting. Mucius gave him his name, Gaius Mucius, Roman citizen, and then, to demonstrate what Lars Porsena's fire and torture could expect from a Roman, he thrust his own right hand into the flame of the altar brazier that stood nearby and held it there without flinching until the flesh burned away, staring at Porsena while it happened. The king, by every ancient account, was shaken. He ordered Mucius released and returned to Rome unharmed. Mucius, crossing back, revealed the bluff he had played. He told Porsena that 300 Roman youths had sworn by the same oath to attempt the king's life, and that he had simply been the first to draw the lot. Whether true or not, the psychological impact was devastating. Lars Porsena, a warlord who had come to Rome to restore a king, suddenly understood that he was dealing with a people for whom death was a negotiating position. Gaius Mucius earned the surname Scaevola, left-handed, and it became one of the most honoured family names in Roman history. The crisis did not end there. As part of the peace negotiations that followed, Rome sent hostages to the Etruscan camp, including a group of young women. One of them, a girl named Cloelia, organised an escape. She led her group of hostages down to the Tiber bank and swam the river under Etruscan arrows to return to Rome. Porsena, by now genuinely impressed by the quality of the people he was fighting, sent to Rome requesting Cloelia's return and declaring that, if she came back, he would release her and her companions of his own free will. She was returned. He kept his word. Cloelia was given a mounted statue in the Via Sacra, a Roman woman honoured in bronze on horseback, an honour almost without precedent in the ancient world. The eventual terms of the peace with Porsena remain historically ambiguous. Some ancient sources, including the 1st century BC historian Pliny the Elder, suggest that Rome's treaty with Porsena was humiliating, that it included a prohibition on Romans possessing iron weapons, a detail that would indicate outright submission. Livy rejected this account vigorously, arguing that such a surrender was incompatible with Rome's subsequent history. Modern historians remain divided. What is clear is that Porsena withdrew his army, without restoring Tarquin to the throne, and that the Republic survived. Whether it survived with honour or under a crushing treaty that it later suppressed from its own records is a question Rome never fully answered. What matters is that it survived. With the Etruscan threat contained, Tarquin the Proud made his final throw. He had one alliance left, the cities of the Latin League. These were Rome's nearest neighbours, culturally identical and politically independent, and many of them were deeply uncomfortable with the sudden rise of the Republic as a regional hegemon. Tarquin's son-in-law Octavius Mamilius, the leading man of the Latin city of Tusculum, became the instrument of Tarquin's last hope. Mamilius rallied the Latin cities behind the former king, and the combined Latin army marched to confront Rome in either 499 or 496 BC. The ancient sources disagree on the exact date, near a small volcanic lake in the hills of Latium known as Lake Regillus. The Roman Senate responded to the crisis by appointing a dictator, a constitutional emergency measure they had wisely built into the Republican system for exactly such moments. Rather than having two consuls share command in a crisis of this magnitude, the Senate could suspend the normal structure and grant supreme command to a single man for a maximum of 6 months. The dictator appointed for the Battle of Lake Regillus was Aulus Postumius Albinus. His master of horse, the dictator's second in command, was Titus Abutius. The battle was a savage, closely contested affair. Both Roman consuls were wounded and carried from the field early in the fighting. Mamilius was killed. The Romans, fighting alongside the exiled king, Roman aristocrats who had joined the Tarquinian conspiracy or followed their families into exile, fought with the desperate fury of men who had nothing left to lose, and at one point drove the Roman line back toward the lake. Postumius, to stop his own troops from fleeing, is said to have ordered his personal bodyguard to treat any Roman soldier retreating without orders as an enemy and to cut him down. The line held. In the late stages of the battle, with both sides exhausted and the outcome hanging by a thread, the Romans reported that 2 divine riders appeared, enormous men on white horses, fighting alongside the legions. Roman tradition identified them as the divine twins Castor and Pollux, the patron gods of Roman cavalry. Whether divine intervention occurred or whether this was the battle fever of traumatized soldiers, the Roman cavalry charged at the critical moment and broke the Latin line. The Latin army collapsed. Tarquin the Proud, wounded in the fighting, was carried from the field to exile in Cumae, where he died shortly afterward. The last king of Rome died in a foreign city, among strangers, and the Latin League that had been his final weapon signed a treaty with Rome 3 years later. The Fidus Cassianum, the Cassian Treaty of 493 BC, negotiated by the consul Spurius Cassius Vetilinus, ended the Latin War and transformed the relationship between Rome and the Latin cities. It was formally a treaty between equals. The Romans and the Latin League pledged mutual defence, equal division of war spoils, and perpetual peace between themselves. In practice, Rome was slightly more equal than the others, but it was a partnership, not a domination, and the combined military force it created would give Rome the manpower reserves to survive the wars that were coming. With Tarquin dead and the Latin crisis resolved, Rome might have hoped for a period of consolidation. Instead, it spent the better part of the next century fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously against 3 separate enemies who, taken together, very nearly did what Tarquin and Porsena could not. The Volsci were an Oscan-speaking Italic people occupying the territory south of Latium, in the valleys between the Alban Hills and the sea. They were aggressive, well-organised, and deeply hostile to Roman expansion into their territory. Beginning almost immediately after the founding of the Republic, the Volsci launched regular raiding expeditions into the Latin plain, burning farms, taking captives, and testing Roman defences year after year. The war against them was not a single campaign. It was a grinding, multi-generational conflict that produced one of Rome's most famous and most tragic heroes, a man named Gnaeus Marcius, who was given the cognomen Coriolanus after capturing the Volscian town of Corioli in 493 BC. Coriolanus later fell out catastrophically with the Roman plebs, was exiled, joined the Volsci, led a Volscian army to the gates of Rome itself, and was then talked out of destroying his own city by his mother. His story, which will have an entire episode of its own someday on this channel, is the early republic in miniature. Heroism, political failure, exile, and near self-destruction. The Aequi were, if anything, even more dangerous in the short term. They occupied the high, Apennine valleys to the east of Rome, commanding the mountain passes through which Roman armies had to move to fight anyone in the interior of Italy. The Aequi understood their strategic position perfectly. They used the Algidus Pass, above the city of Tusculum, as a staging point for raids deep into Latium, and they were skilled enough in mountain warfare to make Roman pitched battle tactics frustratingly ineffective. The Roman dictator Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, another figure who deserves his own documentary, famously had to be called from his plough in 458 BC to deal with a Roman army trapped by the Aequi in the Algidus Pass. He destroyed the Aequi in a single day, celebrated a triumph, and resigned the dictatorship within 15 days of being appointed to it, returning to his farm. The Romans told this story for 500 years as the perfect model of republican virtue. The Sabines, to the northeast, were a perennial third front. Rome fought them almost continuously throughout the 5th century BC. The wars against the Sabines, Volsci and Aequi were not glamorous. They produced no single defining battle, no dramatic reversal, no moment of extraordinary climax. They were the slow, brutal, exhausting work of a city that had chosen to exist in the most contested geography in the Italian world and had decided it was not going to be pushed off it. Every year, the consuls took the field. Every year, men died in anonymous hill skirmishes and ambushed river crossings and burning farmsteads. Every year, Rome came back. While Rome was fighting all of these external wars, it was simultaneously fighting a war within itself, and this internal war, though it produced no great battles and no famous single moment, may have been the most consequential conflict the early republic faced. It is known to history as the conflict of the orders, the century-long struggle between the patricians, the old aristocratic families who held a hereditary monopoly on the major offices of the state, and the plebeians, the common citizens who comprised the vast majority of Rome's population, fought its wars, paid its taxes, and had almost no formal political rights at all. The patricians controlled the Senate, the consulship, the priesthoods, the courts, and the law itself. In the early republic, the law was not even written down. It existed in the collective memory of the patrician families, who could interpret it however suited their interests. A plebeian who incurred debt could, under the brutal law of Nexum, be seized by his creditor and subjected to a form of debt bondage that was effectively slavery within the Roman legal system. Plebeian farmers who served in the army and returned to find their fields ruined and their debts multiplied had no political recourse, no magistrate they could appeal to, no court that would hear them, no assembly that had real power. In 494 BC, with Rome simultaneously fighting the Aequi, the Volsci and the Sabines, the plebeian soldiers simply left. They marched out of Rome as a body to the Sacred Mount, a hill north of the city, and sat down. No riot, no bloodshed. They just stopped. They stopped serving in the army. They stopped working the fields. They stopped being part of Rome, and they dared the patricians to manage without them. This event, the first secession of the plebs, was one of the most remarkable acts of collective political action in the ancient world. It worked. The patricians, facing external enemies on 3 fronts with no army to fight them, negotiated. The result was the creation of an entirely new office, the tribune of the plebs, 2 of them initially, then growing to 10. They held the power of sacrosanctity. Their persons were legally inviolable, protected by a sacred oath sworn by the entire plebeian community, that any man who harmed a tribune would be an outlaw before both gods and men, and they held the most powerful defensive veto in the Roman system, the intercessio. A tribune could walk into any Roman court, any Senate proceeding, any magistrate's office and say a single word, veto, I forbid, and the proceeding stopped dead. This was a knife embedded in the Roman constitution, a knife that pointed directly at patrician power, and the patricians had agreed to put it there because they had no choice. The conflict of the orders would continue for another century and a half, producing the codification of the 12 Tables of Law in 450 BC, the first written legal code in Roman history, inscribed on bronze tablets and posted publicly in the Forum so that any Roman could read the law that governed him, and eventually the Licinian Sextian laws of 367 BC, which opened the consulship itself to plebeians. The Republic ground its way through crisis after crisis toward a more inclusive system of governance, not because the patricians became generous, but because the plebeians never stopped fighting. Rome's internal politics were as violent, as contested, and as formative as any battle fought on its borders. The Republic was being hammered into shape from both the outside and the inside simultaneously. And then, in 390 BC, everything that had been built came within a sword's length of being permanently destroyed. Everything we have covered so far, the Seven Kings, the Revolution, the early Republic's desperate wars of survival, all of it was prologue to a single event that the Romans could never fully escape. An event so catastrophic, so humiliating, and so psychologically foundational that its shadow fell across every Roman military decision for the next 400 years. A day later, writers treated as the Dies Aliensis, an ill-omened anniversary that haunted Roman memory for centuries, traditionally dated to August 19, 390 BC. Many modern chronologies place it around 387/386 BC. The Gauls are coming, and Rome is not ready. The people who would destroy Rome did not come from a distant alien civilization. They came from northern Italy, from the broad fertile valley of the Po River that the Romans would eventually call Cisalpine Gaul on this side of the Alps. Several Celtic tribes had been pushing down from Transalpine Gaul across the Alpine passes for generations, and by the early 4th century BC, the most aggressive and mobile of them, the Senones, had settled along the Adriatic coast of northern Italy in the region that would take their name, the Ager Gallicus, the Gallic territory. The Senones were not undisciplined raiders living in caves. They were a sophisticated Celtic people with their own social hierarchies, their own laws, their own warrior aristocracy, and a military system built around the terrifying shock charge of their heavy infantry. Tall men, many of them fair-haired, fighting with long iron swords and large swords, oval shields, advancing behind a wall of noise that ancient sources describe as physically disorienting. The Roman soldiers who had fought the Etruscans, the Equi, and the Volsci had learned to fight in a specific way against a specific type of enemy. The Gauls were something completely different, and in 390 BC, the Romans had never faced anything like them. The immediate trigger for the war was a diplomatic catastrophe of Rome's own making. The Senones under their chieftain Brennus had marched south along the Adriatic coast and laid siege to the Etruscan city of Clusium, the same powerful city whose king, Lars Porsena, had threatened Rome barely a century before. The Clusians, now facing an existential threat from the north rather than expanding southward, appealed to Rome for help. Rome sent 3 ambassadors, members of the patrician Fabii family, to negotiate between Clusium and the Senones. What happened next is one of the most consequential diplomatic blunders in Roman history. During a sortie from Clusium against the besieging Gauls, one of the Roman ambassadors, Quintus Fabius Ambustus, picked up a weapon and killed a Gallic warrior chieftain in single combat. He was supposed to be a neutral negotiator. He was a protected envoy under the rules of ancient international law, the same rules of the fetiales that Rome itself had codified. He had violated every principle of diplomatic immunity. Brennus demanded that the Roman ambassadors be handed over to Gallic justice. The Roman Senate, in a decision that ranged from cowardly to catastrophic, not only refused to surrender the Fabii, but actually elected one of them to military office for the coming year, a deliberate public insult. Brennus received the message without ambiguity. He broke off the siege of Clusium, turned his entire army south, and marched directly for Rome. The Roman reaction was panic dressed as action. An army was hastily assembled, under strength, underprepared, and poorly commanded, and marched north to meet the Senones on the road. They met them 11 miles north of Rome, at a small tributary of the Tiber called the Allia River. The date entered Roman history in letters of fire. The Roman force that met Brennus at the Allia was not the full army of the Republic. It could not be, because the Gauls had moved too fast for a proper levy to be organised. The army that took the field was approximately 40,000 men by ancient estimates, though modern scholars consider this figure inflated. What is beyond dispute is that the Roman line was shorter than the Gallic one, meaning that the flanks were vulnerable to being overlapped and enveloped from the start. The Roman commanders, tribunes with consular power, not consuls, in the constitutional arrangement of that year, made an attempt to compensate. They placed a reserve force on a small hill to the right of the main line, hoping to use the elevated position to threaten any Gallic outflanking movement. This was reasonable in theory. In practice, it handed Brennus the battle before a single sword was drawn. Brennus saw the detachment on the hill and interpreted it correctly as a potential flanking threat. He changed his attack plan on the spot. Instead of advancing against the Roman centre first, he sent his best warriors, possibly his cavalry, in a direct assault on the Roman reserve on the hill. The reserve, smaller than the main line, and suddenly the focus of the entire Gallic attack, was hit with ferocious speed and violence. It broke, and when it broke, it did not break quietly. The sight of the reserve dissolving in chaos and running spread panic through the Roman main line with the speed of fire through dry grass. The Roman left wing, nearest the river, turned and ran. Most of them fled to the recently conquered Etruscan city of Veii, crossing the Tiber in desperate swimming and wading rather than facing the advancing Gauls. The Roman right wing fled toward Rome itself. Some of them made it inside the city walls. The majority ran directly to the Capitoline Hill, the great rocky citadel at the centre of Rome, and began fortifying it for a last stand. Livy records the scene at the Allia with barely concealed shame. None of them were slain while actually fighting, he wrote. They were cut down from behind whilst hindering one another's flight in a confused, struggling mass. There was no heroic last stand at the Allia. There was no Horatius this time, no man stepping forward to buy time with his body. The Roman army at the Allia simply ceased to exist as a fighting force within minutes of first contact. It was, in Livy's own words, not a battle, but a massacre of men already running. The road to Rome lay open. The Gauls, slightly stunned by the ease of it, camped for the night before advancing. That single night was the only thing that saved any Romans at all. When news of the Allia reached Rome, the city did not hold its nerve. It broke. The majority of the civilian population, men, women, children, everything they could carry, fled south and east into the Latin countryside, pouring into the allied Latin towns or taking shelter in the hills. The city gates were left open. Most of the city itself was left undefended, but not quite all of it. A decision was made, pragmatic, cold-blooded and morally complicated, to concentrate Rome's limited remaining fighting men and its most sacred objects on the Capitoline Hill, the most naturally defensible point in the city, and abandon the rest of Rome to whatever fate was coming. The Vestal virgins were evacuated first, carrying the sacred relics and eternal flame of Vesta. According to Livy, a plebeian man named Lucius Albinus, fleeing south on a cart with his family, encountered the Vestals on the road and immediately unloaded his family's possessions into the ditch so that the priestesses could ride instead. Whatever Rome had been reduced to, it remembered what was sacred. The senators and elders who were too old to fight and had no intention of fleeing held a formal meeting in the Forum, and the decision they made at that meeting remains one of the most haunting images in all of Roman history. Having served their city and their offices, and judging that a flight unbecoming of their dignity was worse than whatever the Gauls would do, the elderly senators, dressed in their formal robes of office, sat down in their ivory curule chairs in the Forum and the vestibules of their great houses, and waited. They had survived too much, given too much to die running. When the Senones entered Rome, cautiously, almost reverently, the ancient sources suggest, as if hardly believing that the city that had humiliated Porsena and broken every enemy for a century could truly be this empty, they found the streets silent and the doors open. They walked through, a ghost city. And then they came to the forum and found the old men sitting there in their robes, motionless as statues. For a long moment the Gauls stood and stared. One warrior, according to Livy, reached out and stroked the beard of an aged senator named Marcus Papirius, perhaps testing whether the old man was real or carved. Marcus Papirius struck him across the face with his ivory staff. The Gaul killed him. And Rome began to burn. For 7 months, by Livy's account, Rome burned and was looted while the garrison on the Capitoline Hill held out. The Gauls stripped the temples, melted the gold offerings, burned the wooden structures that constituted most of the city's buildings, and found that the Capitoline itself was beyond their direct assault. The rocky approach was too steep and too narrow for a mass attack to succeed. They settled in for a siege, and Rome, with no relief army and no food coming in, began to starve. One night. Livy places it in the small hours before dawn, when the darkness was deepest and the sentries most likely to be drowsy. A Gallic raiding party discovered a narrow path up the northwestern face of the Capitoline cliff. The path was so difficult that they left their weapons at the bottom and climbed by hand, passing from man to man in absolute silence. They made it to the top of the cliff without a single Roman sentry noticing. The Roman dogs did not stir. The first Gaul's hands were already on the wall's edge. Then the geese sounded. The sacred geese of Juno, kept in the temple of Juno Moneta on the Capitoline summit, so sacred that the starving garrison had refused to eat them even when food ran out, woke at the disturbance and raised a clamour loud enough to wake the entire garrison. A Roman officer named Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, a former consul, reached the wall first and drove the leading Gaul back off the cliff edge with his shield. The others fell or fled back down the path. The Capitoline held. The Romans remembered this night for centuries. Every year in Rome's later history, in the procession held to commemorate the event, a dog was ritually punished, and the geese were carried in honour through the streets, because the dogs had slept while the geese had saved Rome. It is a small story against the vast catastrophe surrounding it, but it is the story the Romans chose to tell, because it was about vigilance, about the cost of letting your guard down, even for a moment, about what happens when you fall asleep. 7 months of siege and starvation brought the Capitoline garrison to its limit. An agreement was reached. Rome would pay a ransom of 1,000 Roman pounds of gold, approximately 330 kilograms, and the Senones would withdraw. The Senate in exile voted to accept the terms. The gold was gathered from every temple treasury, every aristocratic household that had not been looted, every reserve the city could scrape together. It was brought to the forum in whatever containers they could find. The weighing began, and then the Romans noticed what was happening to the scales. The Gauls were using their own weights. The weights were heavier than Roman standard. Every measure of gold weighed on those scales registered as less than it actually was, systematically cheating Rome out of more than they had agreed to pay. The Roman tribune Quintus Sulpicius protested. He demanded the Roman weights be used. The protest was noted and ignored. And then Brennus reached down to his belt, drew his broadsword, a heavy iron weapon, the length of a man's arm, and threw it onto the scale alongside the Gallic weights. VICTIS. Woe to the conquered. Pay it all, pay the extra, pay the sword as well, because the sword is the only scale that matters, and you lost. You brought your rules and your weights and your formal protest to a conversation that was settled 11 miles north of here at the Allia River. You want to argue about weights? That is the weight. That sword. Add it to the gold. Livy records the moment with controlled fury, the shame of a patriotic Roman historian confronting the worst day in the history he loves. He notes that some later Roman accounts claim that the dictator, Marcus Furius Camillus, arrived at this precise moment and interrupted the weighing, that he swept the scales aside, declared that Rome paid its debts in iron rather than gold, and immediately engaged the Gauls in battle and drove them from the city. Modern historians treat this narrative with considerable scepticism, noting that Camillus's arrival at the perfect moment of maximum drama reads more like patriotic myth than historical record. What the earlier Greek sources confirm, including Polybius, writing within 2 centuries of the event, is that the gold was paid, the ransom was delivered, and the Gauls withdrew on their own terms, whether Camillus scattered them in battle or they simply left on schedule after receiving their payment. The Senones departed northward, and Rome was left with what remained, which was very nearly nothing. Marcus Furius Camillus had been Rome's greatest general for over a decade before the Gallic disaster. He had captured the Etruscan city of Veii in 396 BC after a 10-year siege, an extraordinary military achievement, and had celebrated a triumph in which he rode a chariot drawn by 4 white horses, an honour so extravagant that it drew accusations of arrogance and royal pretension. Then, in 391 BC, the year before the Allia, he had been prosecuted on charges of misappropriating war spoils and had gone into voluntary exile at the Latin city of Ardea rather than face a conviction he considered unjust. He was there, in exile, when the Gauls came. Whatever role Camillus actually played in ending the Gallic occupation, the role he unquestionably played in what came next was real and transformative. He was appointed dictator, his 4th time in that office, and given the task of reconstructing Rome from the wreckage. It was not merely a building project, it was the most complete act of institutional, architectural, and psychological reconstruction that any Roman leader had yet attempted. Camillus began with the walls. The old Servian defences, the city's stone circuit walls, were repaired and massively expanded using a superior volcanic stone called Grotta Oscura Tuff, quarried by the conquered people of Veii. The rebuilt Servian wall was approximately 11 kilometres in circumference, standing up to 10 metres high and nearly 4 metres thick at its base, fronted by a deep defensive ditch along the most vulnerable sections. It was one of the biggest defensive construction projects in Italy. Ancient tradition, and some modern estimates, placed the main circuit work in the 370s BC, roughly a dozen years after the sack, though the precise timeline is debated. Rome would never again be an open city vulnerable to sudden assault. There was a debate in the immediate aftermath of the sack about whether to rebuild Rome at all. Some voices, and the ancient sources suggest the argument was serious enough to reach the Senate floor, proposed simply abandoning the ruined site and relocating the entire Roman population to Veii, a far better fortified city whose walls had kept out Roman siege attempts for years. Camillus argued against relocation with the full weight of religious, historical, and political authority he possessed. Rome was not merely a city, he said. It was a covenant between the Roman people and their gods, established on specific ground, at specific altars, through specific rites that could not simply be moved to a new address. The gods had not abandoned Rome. The Romans had temporarily abandoned the gods. They would return to their sacred ground, rebuild their temples, and prove, to the gods, and to every neighbouring people watching, that what had happened was a trial, not an ending. The Senate voted to rebuild. The Roman people returned to the city from their exile in the Latin countryside and began the work. The rebuilding was fast and chaotic. Livy criticises the lack of planning, noting that the city was reconstructed without straight streets or organised property boundaries, which is why ancient Rome was such a labyrinthine tangle of lanes and alleys for the rest of its history. Speed mattered more than order. They needed walls, not urban planning. Camillus was called Rome's second founder. He had been exiled by the city he loved, refused to use that exile as a reason for abandoning it in its worst hour, and spent the remainder of his life. He died in 365 BC, killed by an outbreak of plague, rebuilding, defending, and expanding it. He was chosen as dictator 5 times in total, more than any other Roman in the Republican period. He defeated the Volsci, the Aequi, the Etruscans, and what remained of the Senones in a series of campaigns that reasserted Roman dominance in central Italy after the sack. He was, by any measure, the man most responsible for the fact that there was still a Rome to build an empire from. Metus Gallicus, the Gallic sack of 390 BC, left a wound in the Roman psyche that never fully healed. Modern scholars have a term for the specific variety of anxiety it produced. Metus Gallicus, Gallic fear. It was not a metaphor. It was a documented, institutionalized state of collective dread that shaped Roman policy, law, and military doctrine for centuries. The day of the Alia, later remembered as August 18th, became known as the Dies Aliensis. In the late Republican Empire, Roman writers treated it as a dies religiosus, an ill-omened anniversary on which public business and many rituals were avoided. In the Roman dating system, August 18th is a D15 cal sext, the 15th day, before the calends of Sextilis, and later calendars marked it as a warning from the past. In later Roman political language, a tumultus was a declared state of emergency, under threat of hostile attack, often paired with iostitium that suspended normal public business. Cicero says earlier Romans spoke of a tumultus Gallicus for Gallic threats, and a tumultus Italicus for threats within Italy. In a tumultus, exemptions could be ignored and troops levied fast. The trauma also operated at the level of foreign policy in ways that would echo down through history to Julius Caesar himself. Rome's persistent aggression against the Gallic peoples of northern Italy, the endless wars of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC to conquer and pacify Cisalpine Gaul, was not purely about territory or resources. It was driven in part by an almost obsessive need to ensure that what happened in 390 BC could never happen again. When Caesar used the pretext of Gallic migrations threatening Roman allies to launch his 10-year conquest of all of Transalpine Gaul, the campaign he recorded in his Bellum Gallicum, he was, among other things, resolving the anxiety that Brennus had created 3.5 centuries earlier. The Metus Gallicus was not satisfied until every Gaul from the Rhine to the Pyrenees was either a Roman subject or a Roman ally. It took until 52 BC and the final crushing of Vercingetorix at Alesia for Rome to feel that it had finally closed the account. But before that reckoning could come, before Rome could think about projecting power across the Alps, it had to fix what the Gallic sack had revealed most brutally about its own military system. At the Alia, the Roman phalanx had dissolved in minutes. The carefully drilled shield-to-shield wall of spearmen that had served Rome well against Etruscans and Latins had shattered the moment it faced a completely different type of enemy, fighting a completely different type of battle. The Gauls had not outmaneuvered the Romans. They had simply hit them with a ferocity and speed that the phalanx formation was psychologically and physically unequipped to absorb. And the phalanx, that great flat formation borrowed from the Greeks through Etruscan intermediaries, designed for fighting on flat, open ground in 2 straight lines, had another problem that the campaigns against the Samnites to the south were about to expose without mercy. It could not fight in the mountains. Rome was about to learn that lesson the hard way. And from the humiliation of that lesson, it would create the most effective military machine the ancient world had ever seen. Everything that came before, the kings, the revolution, the Gallic catastrophe, the desperate early wars of survival, everything was preparation. The forge, the fire, the hammer falling again and again on heated metal. But the final shaping, the act that produced the weapon that would conquer the ancient world, happened here, in these mountains, against these people, in 3 wars that lasted, with pauses, for over half a century and cost Rome more blood, more humiliation, and more institutional transformation than any conflict it had yet faced. The Samnites were not a people who showed up in a crisis and then disappeared. They were a permanent structural challenge, Rome's most dangerous neighbours for 3 generations, and the lesson they taught Rome, painfully and at enormous cost, was the most important military lesson in the history of the Western world. That the weapon you use to win your last war is not necessarily the weapon you need for the next one. Rome had gone to the mountains with a phalanx, the mountains destroyed the phalanx, and in the wreckage Rome built something new, something that had never existed before. The Manipular Legion was not an invention, it was a survival response. It was what happened when a city that refused to lose faced an enemy it could not beat and refused to keep losing. The Samnites occupied the broad, rugged, mountainous territory of south-central Italy that the Romans called Samnium, a region covering much of modern Campania, Molise, and Abruzzo. They were not a single unified state, but a confederation of 4 major tribes, the Hirpini, Caudini, Caratini, and Pentri. loosely bound together by shared language, culture, religion, and a tradition of military cooperation through the institution of the tuto, a community assembly capable of raising and directing military force across tribal lines. What made the Samnites uniquely dangerous was the marriage of two qualities that rarely coexist so completely in a military people. They were magnificent mountain fighters with generations of experience in the terrain that would now become Rome's battlefield, and they were also sophisticated enough to organise, supply and sustain armies in the field for extended campaigns. Their warriors fought with 2 heavy javelins and a broad-bladed sword, protected by an oval shield, bronze helmet, and a single bronze greave on the left leg, a specifically adapted equipment load designed for the rapid movement and shock combat of mountain warfare. They had no interest in the formal pitched battle on open ground that Greek and Etruscan military tradition had bequeathed to Rome. They preferred ambush, terrain exploitation, and the kind of attritional warfare that drained a conventional army of men, morale and supply lines long before a single decisive engagement was possible. Against the Roman phalanx, that rigid, flat, shoulder-to-shoulder wall of spears designed for level ground, the Samnites had a specific and devastating answer. They simply did not fight on level ground. They took the fight uphill, into the passes, into the narrow defiles where the phalanx could not manoeuvre, could not redress its line, and could not exploit its discipline and mass. In the mountains, the phalanx was not a weapon, it was a trap. Rome was about to walk into that trap, in some cases literally, more than once. The First Samnite War began not with a Roman decision to conquer the Samnites, but with an invitation from a city that needed saving. Capua, the largest and wealthiest city of Campania, sitting in the rich volcanic plain between the Apennines and the coast, had come under Samnite attack and appealed to Rome for military assistance. The appeal was politically awkward. Rome had an existing alliance with the Samnites dating from 354 BC. Accepting Capua's invitation meant breaking it. Rome broke it. The strategic calculation was straightforward. Campania was the most fertile agricultural land in all of Italy. Whoever controlled Capua controlled the grain supply and the trading networks of the entire southern Italian coast. Rome looked at Capua and its wealth, and decided that the value of the Samnite alliance did not outweigh the value of Campanian hegemony. The First Samnite War lasted only 2 years, and produced Roman victories in several engagements, most notably at Mount Garus and at Suessula, but ended inconclusively with a peace treaty that more or less restored the pre-war boundaries. Rome had demonstrated that it could fight in southern Italy, but it had not broken Samnite power or secured Campania permanently. And almost immediately after the war ended, Rome faced a crisis that the Samnite War had quietly triggered: the Latin Revolt. The Latin cities, those same communities that had been Rome's partners under the Foedus Cassianum since 493 BC, had watched the First Samnite War with alarm. Rome was clearly expanding south. Roman colonies were being planted in Latium and beyond. The Latin cities feared that partnership was turning into subordination, and in 340 BC they issued Rome an ultimatum that bordered on audacity. They demanded equal representation in the Roman Senate and full integration into the Roman state, or they would fight for independence. Rome's answer was 2 years of brutal war. The decisive battle was fought near Mount Vesuvius in 339 BC, where the Roman consul Publius Decius Mus, the elder, not the son who would die at Sentinum, performed the first recorded act of devotio in Roman military history. The omens had declared that one of the 2 consuls would die in the battle, and that whichever side he belonged to would lose. Decius Mus performed the formal ritual, dedicating himself and the enemy army to the gods of the underworld, and charged alone into the Latin line. He was killed immediately. The Romans, electrified by the sacrifice, rallied and broke the Latin army. His colleague Titus Manlius Torquatus completed the destruction. The Latin War ended in 338 BC with a settlement that established the framework of Roman dominance in Italy for the next 2 centuries. The Latin League was dissolved. Some Latin cities, including Tusculum and Aricia, received full Roman citizenship. Others received partial rights with limited political voice. The Latin cities lost their independence as a collective entity and were bound individually to Rome in a web of separate bilateral alliances that prevented them from ever again acting as a coordinated bloc against Roman power. Rome had mastered the art of divide and bind, and the network it built from 338 BC onward became the foundation of the Italian Confederation that would give Rome the manpower to survive Hannibal. The Second Samnite War, known to Roman historians simply as the Great Samnite War, was the defining conflict of the Republic's 4th century, and it produced the most humiliating military disaster in Roman history up to that point. It began in 326 BC, when Rome intervened in a conflict over the city of Naples, then in the hands of a Samnite-backed faction, and accepted Naples into the Roman alliance system in an agreement that positioned Roman power firmly in Campania. The Samnites, who had watched Roman expansion with growing fury through the entire Latin war period, recognized that Roman dominance of Campania was existential for them. If Rome controlled the fertile coastal plain, Samnite power in the mountains was eventually irrelevant. The war that followed was for the control of Italy itself. In its first years, the Second Samnite War went badly for Rome. The Samnites were fighting in their own mountain heartland, and they fought with the full advantages that terrain and familiarity could provide. Several early Roman expeditions achieved little. The Samnites avoided pitched battle where possible, used the mountains to exhaust Roman supply lines, and struck at Roman positions with devastating precision when Roman forces became strung out or overextended. But by 321 BC, Rome's consuls, Titus Veturius Calvinus and Spurius Postumius Albinus, believed they had an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow. They had received intelligence that the Samnite general Gaius Pontius was threatening the Roman garrison at Luceria in Apulia, far to the southeast. To relieve Luceria quickly, the consuls decided to take their army through a shortcut, a narrow mountain pass near the Samnite town of Cordium, in the heart of Samnite territory. It was a trap, and it had been designed for exactly this kind of Roman confidence. The Caudine Forks, the Latin term Furculae Caudinae, the Caudine Passes, referred to a specific geographical feature near Cordium, 2 narrow defiles connected by a broad meadow, like an hourglass cut into the mountains. The Roman army, moving in marching order rather than battle formation, entered the outer defile and advanced into the meadow. When they reached the inner defile, which should have been their exit, they found it blocked. Felled trees, boulders, and armed Samnites on every height. They turned around. The outer defile was now blocked as well. The Roman army, several legions, somewhere between 20 and 40,000 men depending on the ancient source used, was trapped in a mountain meadow with no room to form a battle line and no route of escape. Gaius Pontius had executed one of the most perfectly designed strategic encirclements in ancient military history. And he had done it without killing a single Roman soldier. The Roman command held councils for days. Every option was examined and rejected. A frontal assault on either blocked defile would be suicide. The Samnites held the heights and could simply roll boulders and fire missiles down onto any force attempting to break through. The Romans had food for a limited time and no prospect of reinforcement. After several days of fruitless deliberation, Spurius Postumius sent a messenger to Pontius asking for terms. Pontius consulted his own father, a man named Herennius Pontius, elderly and reputedly the wisest counsellor in Samnium. The old man gave his son advice that Pontius found impossible to follow in either direction. Either kill all the Romans, Herennius said, and break Roman power decisively, or release them all immediately without conditions and earn their gratitude in a gesture so magnanimous it might produce a permanent peace. Any middle course, any humiliation that stopped short of breaking Rome completely, would produce an enemy more dangerous than the one you have now, because wounded pride is more durable than intact power. Pontius chose the middle course. The terms he imposed were designed to humiliate. The entire Roman army, consuls, officers, soldiers, would be stripped of their weapons and their armour. They would retain only their tunics. They would be marched in pairs, under a yoke formed by 2 spears set upright in the ground with a third laid, across the top, a gesture specifically designed to reduce soldiers to the status of defeated animals. And then they would be released, unharmed, to walk back to Rome. The Roman army passed under the yoke at Cordium in 321 BC. Every man, from the consuls to the youngest common soldier, ducked his head and walked beneath that frame of spears. The Samnites lined the route. The silence, by ancient accounts, was absolute. No Roman spoke. No Roman was struck or mocked. The Samnites simply watched. The silence was, in some ways, worse than any taunting. The Romans arrived back in Rome without weapons, without armour, without horses, and without the words to describe what had happened to them. The city received them in stunned, shamed silence. Livy records that people hid indoors rather than look at the returning soldiers. The consuls resigned immediately. The Senate debated for weeks whether to honour the agreement made at Cordium, a debate that resolved itself, typically Roman, into a compromise that satisfied no one. The consuls who had made the agreement were handed over to the Samnites as the price of repudiation. The Samnites rejected this absurd gesture, and Rome simply continued the war as if the agreement had never existed. It was not Rome's finest legal moment, but the instinct behind it was correct. Cordium was not the end. It was the beginning of a transformation. The defeat at the Caudine Forks, combined with the accumulated lessons of a decade of mountain warfare against the Samnites, forced Rome's military thinkers to confront a problem they could no longer ignore. The phalanx, the formation they had inherited from the Etruscans and refined through the Servian reforms, was a magnificent weapon in the right conditions. On flat, open ground against an enemy willing to meet it head-on in a conventional pitched battle, the phalanx was nearly unbeatable. Every man was locked to his neighbour. The mass and momentum of the formation concentrated the force of hundreds of individuals into a single irresistible push. But in the Apennine Mountains, the phalanx was an anchor. It required flat, clear ground to maintain its formation. Broken terrain, slopes, ravines, and rocks shattered the line into isolated fragments. Individual groups became separated and surrounded. Commands could not be communicated from one end of the formation to the other. The entire tactical logic of the phalanx, mass, cohesion, collective momentum, ceased to function the moment the ground became irregular. And in Samnium, all ground was irregular. The Roman military response was to break the phalanx apart, deliberately, structurally, and permanently, into smaller, self-sufficient tactical units called maniples. The word comes from the Latin manipulus, a handful, a bundle, and it described a unit of approximately 120 men that could operate independently of the units on either side of it, yet could be rapidly combined with those units into a coherent battle line when the terrain allowed it. The maniple was a building block rather than a fixed position. It could advance, wheel, retreat, reform, and fill gaps without the entire formation collapsing. The Manipular Legion, as it developed over the course of the Samnite Wars, and as the Greek historian Polybius described it in its mature form in the 2nd century BC, was organised into 3 battle lines based on age and experience. The first line was the Hastati, the youngest soldiers, lightly armoured by legionary standards, armed with 2 heavy-throwing javelins called pila and a short stabbing sword called the gladius. Behind them stood the princeps, experienced men in the prime of their military careers, similarly armed, carrying the full equipment of heavy infantry. And behind the princeps, as the final reserve, stood the triarii, the oldest, most veteran soldiers in the legion, armed not with the pilum, but with the long hasta spear, more in the tradition of the old phalanx. When things went badly in a battle, the triarii would lower their spears and advance, forming an anchor line behind which the battered Astati and Principes could rally. The Roman expression for a desperate situation, rema triarios venis, the matter has come down to the triarii, survived in common Latin speech for centuries, a linguistic fossil of the moment when the legion's final reserve was all that stood between survival and destruction. The tactical arrangement of the 3 lines in battle was the quincunx, the checkerboard, with the maniples of the hastati staggered in front of the gaps between the maniples of the principes and the maniples of the principes staggered in front of the triarii gaps. The entire formation was flexible, mutually supporting, and capable of continuous tactical manoeuvre. Gaps in the first line could be covered by the second. The third line was always there, immovable. And unlike the phalanx, in which required every man to maintain his exact position, or the entire formation degraded, the manipular system was robust. It could absorb casualties, adjust to terrain, and keep fighting even when large sections of the formation had been disrupted. The pilum, the heavy javelin thrown at close range just before the Roman lines closed with the enemy, deserves particular attention, because it was not merely a weapon. It was an engineering solution to a tactical problem. The pilum had a long iron shank attached to a wooden shaft, designed so that the iron would bend on impact, embedding itself in the enemy's shield and rendering that shield useless, too heavy to carry with the iron dragging it down, impossible to remove quickly in the middle of a melee. An enemy hit by a volley of peeler at 15 meters was not simply absorbing missiles, he was being systematically stripped of his primary defensive equipment at exactly the moment the Roman line crashed into him. The pilum was one of the most elegant offensive weapons ever designed. Together the maniple, the quincunx formation, the pilum, and the gladius constituted a system, not just a collection of equipment changes, but an integrated tactical doctrine that was greater than the sum of its parts. The manipular legion could fight in mountains, it could fight on plains, it could fight in forests, in river valleys, against cavalry, against infantry, against the shock charge of Gallic warriors and the disciplined formations of Greek phalanxes. It was the most adaptable military system that had yet appeared in the ancient world, and Rome would use it with continuous refinement for the next 4 centuries. The Samnites did not give up after the Second War ended inconclusively in 304 BC. Rome had recovered from Cordium with astonishing speed, winning major battles at Lotulae and then at Luceria, gradually turning the tide through the 310 BC, and the Second War concluded with a peace that was formally equal, but practically another step in Rome's southward expansion. The Samnites knew what was coming. By 298 BC, they made one final attempt to stop it, this time building the broadest anti-Roman coalition that central Italy had ever seen. They brought in the Sennan Gauls from the north, the same people who had sacked Rome 90 years before, whose very name still triggered the metus Gallicus in every Roman chest. They recruited the Etruscans, who had watched Rome absorb the Latin cities and Campania, and understood that their own independence was next on the list. They added the Umbrians from north-central Italy. 4 peoples, simultaneously hostile, coordinating their movements to stretch Roman military resources across an impossibly wide front. Rome responded not with panic, but with the systematic competence that the Samnite Wars had built into its institutional reflexes. It sent separate consular armies to deal with each threat individually, using its central position and interior lines of movement to concentrate force at each point of crisis before the coalition's members could reinforce each other. The strategy was working, slowly, expensively, but working, when the Great Crisis came in 295 BC. At Sentinum, in Umbria, the 2 main armies of the coalition, the Senoan Gauls and the Samnites, under their commander Gellius Ignatius, converged with the Roman forces under the consuls Quintus Fabius, Maximus Rullianus, and Publius Decius Mus the Younger, son of the man who had performed devotio at Vesuvius a generation before. The armies were approximately equal in number. The terrain was open enough for the Roman manipular system to operate. This was going to be the decisive battle, and everyone on both sides understood it. The Roman right wing under Fabius faced the Samnites. The Roman left wing under Decius faced the Gauls. The fighting opened with a Gallic chariot charge on the left, a weapon the Romans had rarely encountered and had no specific tactical answer to. The Gallic chariots drove through the Roman cavalry on the left and created chaos in the first line of the hastati. The Roman left began to buckle. Decius, watching his wing beginning to give way, made the same decision his father had made at Vesuvius. He called for the Pontifex Maximus. He performed the ritual of devotio, dedicating himself, his legions and the enemy army to the gods of the underworld in the full formal ceremony prescribed by Roman sacred law. He mounted his horse, and then, with his eyes fixed on the Gallic line ahead of him, he rode alone into the middle of the enemy army and was killed. The Roman left, watching their commander perform the ultimate sacrifice, did not break. They rallied. The ritual of devotio worked on the Romans, who witnessed it as much as it worked on the enemy it was meant to terrify. The left held. On the right, Fabius, who had been conserving his strength, holding his veteran reserves through the morning's fighting, now unleashed everything. The Samnites were crushed. Fabius then wheeled his right wing inward and fell on the Gauls from the flank. Caught between the rallied Roman left and the hammer blow of Fabius's wheeling veterans, the Gallic formation shattered. Gellius Egnatius was killed in the fighting. The coalition army collapsed. Ancient sources record Roman losses at Centenium at approximately 8,200 men, a significant toll that reflects how hard the fighting was. The coalition suffered, by the same sources, 25,000 dead and 8,000 prisoners. The Etruscans and Umbrians, seeing the result, pulled out of the coalition and sued for peace separately. The Samnites fought on for 5 more years in a slowly losing guerrilla resistance. By 290 BC, when the consul Manius Curius Dentatus finally forced their final surrender, the Samnites accepted a treaty that made them Roman allies, subordinate, bound, and permanently stripped of the independent foreign policy that had made them dangerous. By 290 BC, Rome's position in Italy was without precedent. It controlled or directly allied with virtually every significant people, from the Arno River in the north to the Strait of Messina in the south. The network it had built was a military marvel, not an empire in the Macedonian sense, not a territory administered by Roman governors and taxed by Roman officials, but a federation of communities each individually bound to Rome by alliance treaties of varying terms. Some had full Roman citizenship, some had Latin rights, a partial citizenship that carried civil but not political privileges. Some were socii, allied peoples who owed military service to Rome in exchange for autonomy in their internal affairs. The specific terms varied from city to city, from tribe to tribe, but the common thread was this. In any war Rome chose to fight, every one of these communities was obligated to supply troops. This was Rome's real strategic revolution, not the manipular legion, though the legion was magnificent. The revolution was the Italian Federation itself. No Mediterranean state of the 3rd century BC, not Carthage, not Macedonia, not the Seleucid Empire, could match the raw manpower reserves that Rome's Italian network provided. In a crisis, Rome could lose battle after battle and still replace every army it lost, because the Federation would keep producing soldiers. Hannibal would discover this to his fury and despair in the Second Punic War, when he won 3 of the greatest battles in ancient military history and still could not break Rome, because every time he destroyed a Roman army, another one was forming behind it. The Samnites, in the end, produced 2 gifts for the civilization that conquered them. They gave Rome the military humiliation that forced it to invent the manipular legion, and they gave Rome the half-century of warfare that field-tested that legion into the most effective fighting force on earth. There is a painful irony in the fact that the people who bled hardest to deny Rome's dominance of Italy were, ultimately, the people most responsible for giving Rome the tools to dominate the world beyond it. The Italian peninsula was Rome's, 390 miles of coastline on the Adriatic side, 600 miles on the Tyrrhenian. Mountains, plains, river valleys, volcanic fields, ancient cities, and the best farmland in the Mediterranean basin. And on the southern tip of this peninsula, close enough on a clear day to see the smoke from the other shore, lay the island of Sicily, and beyond it, across the narrow strait that the Greeks called the Libyan Sea, the city that was Rome's equal in wealth, in naval power, in commercial reach, and in ruthless ambition, Carthage. The wolf of the Tiber had learned to hunt. Now it was going to look across the water, and everything that had been built, from Romulus's fratricide on the Palatine Hill to the manipular legions bloodied in the Apennine passes, was about to be tested on a scale that the 7 kings and the first consuls and Brennus and all of them together could never have imagined. The Punic Wars were coming. stand back for a moment and look at what we have just witnessed. From a single act of fratricide on the Palatine Hill in 753 BC to the final defeat of the Samnites in 290 BC, 4.5 centuries of violence, crisis, transformation, and survival, and the city on the Tiber is still there. More than still there. It has become something that its founders could not have conceived, and its enemies should have stopped before it got this far. Rome in 290 BC is not the desperate hilltop settlement that trembled under Lars Porsena's siege. It is not the shamed republic that limped home from the Caudine Forks without weapons or armour. It is not the burned-out ruin that the survivors who crossed the Tiber after the Allia found waiting for them on their return. Rome has been through all of that, and every single one of those catastrophes, every humiliation, every defeat, every near-extinction event, produced not collapse but adaptation, not surrender but reinvention. The fratricide of Romulus and Remus told us what this city was made of before it had even drawn its first breath. A city founded in blood does not flinch from blood. It learns to use it. The rape of the Sabine women told us how Rome solved its problems, with organised, calculated boldness followed by total ruthless integration. The 7 kings told us how Rome built its institutions, not in a single act of genius, but through the slow, brutal accumulation of power, law, and reform, each generation inheriting and improving what the last one had managed to create. The revolution of 509 BC told us what Rome would die rather than accept, and the oath sworn over Lucretia's body held for nearly 500 years. The wars of the early Republic told us that survival was not guaranteed, that every generation had to earn its place by the same hard measure that every generation before it had paid. The Gallic sack told us that even the worst disaster, even the burning of the city, the flight of its people, the payment of ransom under a Gaul's contemptuous sword, could not erase what had been built. Because what had been built was not stone, it was character. And the Samnite Wars told us, finally, that Rome was not merely willing to be hurt. It was willing to be changed by what hurt it, to throw away what no longer worked, and build something better from the wreckage. The Manipular legion that marched out of the Samnite Wars was the culmination of all of it. The spear-carrying phalanx of Servius Tullius's reformed army, drilled and disciplined and morally serious, was inside it. The grim, grinding determination of the early Republic's infantry, fighting 3 simultaneous wars on 3 separate fronts for decade after decade, was inside it. The tactical flexibility learned, at enormous cost, on Samnite mountain passes where the old formation could not maneuver was inside it. Every defeat, every disaster, every moment of collective shame that had been turned into institutional learning was encoded in the training, the equipment, the doctrine, and the culture of the legion that now stood ready on the shores of southern Italy. And that legion was looking south across the water. In Sicily, 2 competing powers had been fighting for dominance of the most strategically important island in the Western Mediterranean for over a century. One of them was a network of Greek colonies, rich, cultured, politically fractious, militarily capable, and increasingly desperate for outside help against the other. The other was Carthage, a Phoenician city-state that had grown into a commercial empire spanning the North African coast, southern Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily. Carthage controlled the Western Mediterranean's trade routes with a naval power that no land-based state could challenge. Its merchant fleets carried grain, silver, slaves, and luxury goods from one end of the ancient world to the other. Its army, though largely, composed of hired mercenaries from across the Mediterranean and African worlds, was lavishly equipped, professionally trained, and commanded by some of the finest military minds of the age. In 264 BC, 26 years after the last Samnite sword was laid down, a dispute in the Sicilian city of Messana gave Rome the pretext, and the Carthaginian threat to its allied Italian cities the reason, to cross the water. The First Punic War began. A land power with almost no naval tradition whatsoever was about to fight the greatest naval empire in the Western Mediterranean, and it was going to win because it was going to apply to sea power exactly the same logic it had applied to every other military problem it had ever faced. It was going to get hurt. It was going to learn from getting hurt, and it was going to refuse to stop. 3 Punic Wars, Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants, the near-total annihilation of 3 Roman armies in 3 years, the final, absolute destruction of Carthage itself in 146 BC, its buildings razed, its population enslaved, its very soil cursed so that nothing would grow there. All of it is coming in the next episode of this series, the continuation of this story of how Rome became the world. The wolf raised on the Tiber had eaten everything between the Alps and the toe of Italy. Now it was hungry for something bigger. If this documentary gave you something, if you learned something you did not know before, if you felt what it actually cost those people to build that city, then share it. Put it in front of someone who needs to understand that history is not polite and civilization is not inevitable. It was fought for, bled for, and sometimes paid for with everything a person had. For the full story of what Rome did next, the Punic Wars, Hannibal, Scipio Africanus, and the war that almost ended Western civilization before it could begin, that video is on screen right now. Click it. You're not going to be disappointed. This is Wars in History. We are here every week. Subscribe, hit the bell, and we will see you at the next battle. Rome is not done yet. Not even close.